Good afternoon, all. I'm going to spend 10 minutes for you about, as mentioned, about open source. Basically, open source is everywhere. I think the last couple of years we can see it popping up everywhere. Maybe not literally everywhere, as I've tried to put in here, but you get the point. And it's not only everywhere, everyone is involved. It's the traditional proprietary vendors like Apple, but also people like IBM and even Microsoft nowadays. And did you know that the open source team at Microsoft was, at the point before Red Hat was acquired by IBM, was 4,000 people big. So that was even bigger than the whole set in Red Hat. It's also about who's controlling the project. So, for instance, Drupal is 115,000 people contributing to the Drupal open source project, which is quite a lot. And it's also about proof. It's not just me saying that, or us just empirical seeing it. It's Red Hat does a study that shows that the majority of the people are considering this as being very strategic, and Gartner is doing the same. So there's only a few things that you really need to consider around choosing your open source project wisely. And there's a couple of things that you really need to have a look at. First is the licensing terms. As you know, there are a number of licensing programs that are attached to this open source project. Most commonly used, of course, the Apache licensing, but there are many others that can cause problems down the road in terms of vendor lock-in or infectious licensing terms. So you really need to have a look at that, whether that fits your purpose. The other thing you should be looking at is the community around the open source project itself. So how many people are really involved? If you recall about Drupal, 150,000 people. So there's a lot of people that really care for the project. So there's a very low chance that the project will die at a certain point in time. The same goes for how many commercial entities are actually involved in this. So how many people are using this as part of their own solution, right? So if there's only a handful of customers that are building their whole infrastructure or their IT system around a particular project, there's maybe not a lot of chance that this will be a long time around. And the same goes for commercial companies that are actually trying to build a business around the open source product. You probably want something where multiple people are actually relying on the open source product to give themselves a business. So do your risk assessment wisely and have a look at whether that project is going to be around for a long time and give you all these legal implications. One particular business model I'd like to discuss with you today is the open core model. And as I like to refer to that, as you can see, it's a wolf in sheep clothes. So be very careful considering this model. It could work for you, but there's a few things that you really need to have a look at. So first of all, what is the open core model? It's basically a commercial way of doing a software product based on open source. So really what you usually see is an open source product where there are these enterprise grade features being built onto under a commercial license that you have to pay for. And that creates usually a conflict of interest where the software company that's actually pushing this open core model basically wants you to buy a product, which is not always, of course, in the logic of a pure open source solution. So have a very close look at that open core model, and the risks associated with that is, first of all, because it's a bit of a mixture between open source and commercial licensing, you really want to have an external expert looking at this, what this will mean for you. Because sometimes by just bringing that product in with this particular licensing model, you will end up with all kind of legal implications that forces you to maybe buy a lot of other licenses of the same product because the license itself is very infectious. The other thing to consider is that by starting using this, the company that's actually delivering this open core model product, their support teams are really motivated to sell you their features, their specific enterprise features or their premium features, so that it will lock you in and you'll have to buy those licenses because that's their business model, right? And the other thing is the portability of your solution. By having an open core model, you basically tie yourself into that particular vendor. So there's a huge vendor lock-in which can result in high exit costs, right, by moving to the pure open source thing. So there's a couple of things that you really need to have a look at. And one other thing that I really like to give you a special word of caution is around a couple of the cloud provider announcements. So there are a number of open source products available now on clouds like GCP, AWS and Azure, specifically things like Kafka and Cassandra. And the thing to consider is really, first of all, the business drivers. First, please realize that these cloud providers, their business is not selling you a particular technology or helping you with the technology. They're in the business of selling you, CPU cycles, storage cycles, right? So they're not really interested whether you're doing that on Cassandra, on any other database or whatever. So that's one thing you need to consider. And the second thing is, have a good look at what is actually delivered. For instance, again, on Cassandra, what AWS delivers there is actually a DynamoDB with a Cassandra compatibility layer on top. Azure does the same. Cosmos DB with a Cassandra compatibility layer on top. Can work for you, but please have a look because there are implications there. And the other thing to consider is, as at the first part, these cloud providers, they're not really concerned about the technology itself. They want to run their cloud infrastructure, and therefore getting real support on the technology itself with these cloud providers can be a challenge. So in order to address that, I just want to give you a very high-level overview of Instaclustr as a company where I work for, basically addressing a couple of these things. So first of all, what we do is with a couple of these open source technologies, pure open source technologies will help challenges like expertise, moving away from these proprietary models and scaling these technologies. And we do that with a managed platform. We have consulting services and support services, and we're really focused on the whole life cycle. So we help you from architecture design to implementation to actually running these technologies, and again, based on the pure open source product. So there's no vendor lock-in, and there's no licensing cost there. And then we help you really operating this by running this really at scale for many of our customers. And we give back to the community by providing a lot of additional features under an open source license as well. So the alternatives that you may have under an open core model, for instance on Cassandra, is DataStax is a very good example of an open core vendor. It can work for you, but do your research on what it means for you in terms of vendor lock-in, licensing costs, etc., etc. And the same goes, for instance, for Kafka. Confluent is the open core vendor there. MongoDB, actually, Mongo is really controlled by Mongo itself. 99% of the committers in the Mongo project are employed by Mongo, right? So ask yourself, is this truly an open source product? Do I not link myself too much to one specific vendor with all the implications like license cost, vendor lock-in, etc., etc. Again, it can work, but please have a look at the implications for you. All right, that's basically what I wanted to share with you. I hope it kind of gives you a bit of an insight as more on the strategic side of open source. I really hope it will help you. If you want to talk more about this or have some questions, please see us. We're having a little booth over there where you can also win a €20 gift card. So thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of the day.
Ladies and gentlemen, hands together for Edward Wijnen.